The boy stopped screaming somewhere around hour 14. Not because the pain had lessened. Not because his body had grown numb to the scalpels carving through muscle and bone. He stopped screaming because his throat had torn itself raw, because the vocal cords had shredded themselves into useless ribbons of meat, because even transhuman physiology has its limits when you're conscious for surgery that would kill a grown man in minutes. Brother Apothecary Hadrian didn't pause. His hands continued their work with the precision of a craftsman who had performed this ritual 347 times before. The osmodula had to be placed exactly 2 centimeters from the thyroid, no more, no less. One mistake and the aspirant skeleton would calcify wrong, bones growing inward instead of outward, ribs puncturing lungs, vertebrae fusing into a cage of agony. He'd seen it happen, 17 times to be exact. The boy's eyes tracked Hadrian's movements. They always did. The neophytes couldn't look away even if they wanted to. Part of the process. Part of the breaking. You had to watch yourself being unmade so you could understand what you were becoming. The emperor's will, they called it. Hadrian called it necessity. 10,000 years of necessity. Blood pooled in the catch basin beneath the surgical slab. Too much blood. But the boy's secondary heart was already pumping, compensating, learning. Good. That meant he might survive to see hour 15. Outside the apothecarian, in the frozen wastelands of their chapter's fortress monastery, other aspirants were dying in different ways. Hypothermia, starvation, the claws of the ice WRMS that prowled the crevasses. The trials never stopped, not even when brothers were being forged on the surgical slabs. If you weren't strong enough to survive being hunted while your gene brothers were being cut open, you weren't strong enough to wear the armor. Hadrian had been one of the strong ones. 73 years ago. He remembered his own transformation with the clarity that came from the catalepsia node, the implant that let him recall every detail of every surgery, every scream, every moment his body rejected the foreign organs being jammed into his flesh. The memory never faded. It wasn't supposed to. Memory was suffering, and suffering was the price of becoming more than human. The boy's finger twitched. Just once. Hadrian noticed. He always noticed. "You want to ask if it gets better," Hadrian said. His voice was flat, processed through the vocabulator grill of his helmet. He never removed it during surgery. Neophytes didn't deserve to see his face until they'd earned the right to call themselves brothers. It doesn't. This is the beginning. What comes after is worse. This is the story of what it truly means to become a space marine, and why that transformation is a fate that makes death look like mercy. Not the propaganda spread by the administratum. Not the myths whispered in the hives about the emperor's angels. The truth as lived by the 1,000 warriors who survived the trials and the 100,000 who didn't. If you want to keep exploring the darkest corners of the Imperium, the stories no one else tells, your support makes that possible. But right now, you need to understand what happens when humanity decides to create monsters in the name of salvation. The Schola Progenium called it an honor when the delegation arrived. 12 boys, ranging from 10 to 13 years old, stood in a perfect line in the monastery's central courtyard. They'd been preparing for this moment their entire lives, raised from infancy to believe they were destined for greatness, groomed by the Schola's instructors to be worthy of selection. The best warriors, the finest minds, the most disciplined souls their orphanage could produce. Cale stood forth from the left. He was 11 years old. He'd killed his first man at 9, a punishment exercise, a traitor from the underhive sedated and chained. The instructors wanted to see if the boys had the stomach for it. Cale had. He'd done it without hesitation, without vomiting afterward like 3 of the others, without crying like Matthias, who'd been beaten for his tears and sent to the labor camps. Now, watching the Space Marines stride across the courtyard in their ceramite armor, each footfall a small earthquake, Cale felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years. Fear. Real fear. Not the managed, controlled fear the Schola beat into you during discipline sessions. This was primal, genetic, the kind of fear that came from standing in front of something that wore a human shape but wasn't human anymore. The lead Marine stopped in front of the line. Brother Chaplain Mordrin. The skull-faced helmet turned slowly, scanning each boy in sequence. Kale forced himself to meet those red-eye lenses. Forced himself not to look away. Looking away meant failure. Failure meant the labor camps or servitor conversion or a shallow grave in the waste pits. "You believe you are ready," Mordrin said. The Vox speakers in his armor made each word boom like thunder. "You believe your training has prepared you. You believe you understand what awaits." No one answered. They'd learned years ago that questions from superiors were rarely questions. "You are wrong." Mordrin's gauntlet rose, pointing at the boy to Kale's right. "You. Name. Aspirant Dorian, my lord. How many of your cohort began training at this schola?" 112, my lord." "How many stand here now?" 12, my lord." "Do you know what happened to the others?" Dorian hesitated. Just for a heartbeat. It was enough. "Dead, my lord. In training. In the discipline chambers. During the trials." Mordrin nodded, but the gesture held no warmth, no approval. 112 children. 12 survivors. "You believe this makes you elite. You believe this makes you worthy." The chaplain's voice dropped to something that might have been called gentle if it came from a human throat. 100 boys will begin the trials for our chapter this year. If we are fortunate, 3 will survive to receive the first implant. If we are blessed by the Emperor's grace, perhaps 1 will live long enough to wear our colors. The mathematics hit Kale like a punch. 12 of them standing here. Maybe 3 survivors total. 3 from this line alone. The other 88 aspirants would come from different worlds, different orphanages, different selection ceremonies. All of them believing they were the elite. All of them wrong. "The trials will break you," Mordrin continued. "They are designed to break you, to strip away every piece of what you think you are until only the core remains. And then we take that core and rebuild it into something that can survive what comes next." He started walking down the line again. This time his gauntlet reached out, touching each boy on the shoulder. Some kind of sensor built into the armor, Kale realized. Checking something, measuring them. When Mordrin reached him, the touch lasted longer. The chaplain's helmet tilted slightly, studying him. Kale kept his eyes forward, kept his breathing even, kept every muscle locked in perfect discipline. "This one," Mordrin said to the other Marines. "Mark him. He has the look." Kale didn't know whether to feel pride or terror. Later, he'd learn it was both. Later, he'd learn that having the look just meant you'd suffer longer before you broke. The selection took another hour. Tests of strength, of endurance, of pain tolerance. They made the boys hold red-hot brands against their palms while timing how long they could keep their hands steady. They measured reaction times using shock sticks that hit fast enough to break bones if you didn't dodge. They gave each child a knife and a sedated prisoner and watched to see who killed efficiently versus who hesitated. Kale passed every test. So did 8 others. For failed and were dragged away, screaming, still believing they'd get another chance. They wouldn't. The chapter didn't waste resources on second chances. When the sun set over the Skola's walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Brother Chaplain Mordrin addressed the 9 remaining boys one final time. "Tomorrow you will be taken to our fortress monastery on the moon of Talos 4. The surface temperature averages -70 degrees standard. The atmosphere will freeze your lungs if you breathe too deeply. The native fauna have evolved to hunt in total darkness and can smell fear through ceramite. You will be given a combat knife, a thermal cloak, and 3 days' rations. Your trial is to survive for 10 days and reach the fortress gates." He paused, letting the information settle, letting them process the impossibility of it. "Those who survive will begin training. Those who fail will feed the IceWYRMS. There is no extraction. There is no rescue. There is only the trial and what you become through it." Dorian raised his hand. Brave or stupid, Kale couldn't decide which. "My lord, how many passed this trial last year?" "Last year, 37 began the trial. 2 reached the gates. 1 died 3 days later when his body rejected the first implant." Mordrin's skull helm swiveled to face each of them in turn. "The chapter needs warriors. Not heroes. Not volunteers. Warriors. If you are not willing to become something that can barely be called human anymore, Leave now. Walk through those gates, return to your old lives, and die as men instead of being reborn as weapons. None of them moved. Of course they didn't. They'd been selected because they were the ones who couldn't leave. Because something in their psychology, some flaw or strength or both, meant they'd choose to become monsters rather than remain merely mortal. Cale had known this moment would come since he was 6 years old. Since the first time an instructor had explained what Space Marines were, what they gave up, what they became. He'd known, and he'd still volunteered, still trained, still killed that man in the courtyard without hesitation. Now, standing in the fading light with 8 other boys who'd made the same choice, Cale finally understood what the Schola had really been preparing them for. Not glory, not honor, not even service to the Emperor, though they'd use those words in the decades to come. They'd been preparing them to survive their own transformation. The transport ship came at dawn. A Thunderhawk gunship, black and silver in their chapter's colors, its engines roaring loud enough to crack the monastery's windows. The 9 boys were herded aboard without ceremony, without farewell, without any acknowledgement that they'd spent their entire lives in the Schola. That chapter of their existence was over. The next one was beginning whether they were ready or not. Cale strapped himself into the restraint harness and watched through the viewport as the Schola shrank beneath them. Somewhere down there, new children were already being prepared for next year's selection. The machine never stopped. Couldn't afford to. Brother Apothecary Hadrian stood in the troop bay, one hand gripping the overhead rail, studying the 9 aspirants with the same expression a butcher might give a row of cattle. Evaluating, measuring, deciding which cuts would yield the best meat. 4 of you will be dead within a week, he said without preamble. Not as a threat, as a statement of statistical probability. The trials on Talos 4 have a 78% mortality rate in the first 7 days. Hypothermia, predation, starvation, falls, infection. The moon doesn't care how well you performed in the Schola. He began walking down the line of harnesses, stopping in front of each boy. When he reached Cale, Hadrian's eyes, actually human eyes, Cale noticed with surprise, not the cold lenses of the helmet, fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. You're the one Mordrin marked, the one with the look. Hadrian's voice was quiet enough that only Cale could hear. Do you know what that means? No, sir. It means your body will probably accept the implants. Probably. It means you have the genetic markers we need, the psychological profile that doesn't snap under transformation, the physical resilience to survive having your bones dissolved and regrown stronger. Probably. He leaned closer. It also means you're more likely to survive long enough to understand exactly what you've become. And that, aspirant, is where the real suffering begins. Before Cale could respond, Hadrian moved to the next boy, delivered some other piece of terrible truth, and continued down the line. The apothecary was thorough, methodical. He made sure every single aspirant understood the mathematical reality of their situation before the ship even reached Talos 4. 2 hours into the flight, one of the boys, Marcus, who'd been the fastest runner in their cohort, started crying. Quiet sobs that he tried to muffle against his restraint harness. The other aspirants pretended not to notice. So did the Marines. 3 hours in, Marcus stopped crying, started laughing instead. High-pitched, fractured laughter that bounced off the metal walls of the troop bay. Brother Chaplain Mordrin walked over, studied the boy for exactly 3 seconds, and shot him in the head with a bolt pistol. The explosive decompression of Marcus's skull painted the wall behind him in red and gray. The other 8 aspirants flinched. Cale barely managed not to scream. Fear is acceptable, Mordrin said, holstering the weapon. Terror is acceptable. Doubt is acceptable. Madness is not. The boy had already broken. Better to end it now than waste resources on someone who would fail the first night. He looked at each of the survivors. Clean the wall. You have 10 minutes before we land. They cleaned the wall. Of course they did. What else could they do? When the Thunderhawk's landing gear finally touched down on Talos 4, the rear hatch opened to reveal a landscape of frozen hell. Ice stretched to the horizon in jagged formations that looked like frozen screams. The wind howled with enough force to stagger even the armored marines. And in the distance, barely visible through the blowing snow, a mountain rose like a black tooth against the gray sky. The fortress monastery. Their destination. Their salvation if they could reach it. Brother Chaplain Mordrin handed each aspirant their survival gear. One combat knife. One thermal cloak that looked far too thin to be useful. 3 protein bars that probably had more calories than taste. That was it. No shelter. No additional weapons. No communication devices. The fortress is 240 kilometers northeast, Mordrin said, pointing at the mountain. You have 10 days. If you're not at the gates by then, you've failed. If you lose your knife, you've failed. If you accept help from another aspirant, you've both failed. This is not a team exercise. This is an evaluation of individual worth. Cale looked at the 7 other boys standing beside him on the landing pad. They all had the same expression now. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. The realization that everything they'd thought they understood about survival, about strength, about themselves, was about to be tested in ways the Schola never prepared them for. One more thing, Mordrin added, almost as an afterthought. The Ice WYRMS hunt at night. They can sense heat from 3 kilometers away. Thermal cloaks will help, but won't hide you completely. If you hear clicking sounds in the dark, that's their echolocation. If you see bioluminescence, they've already detected you. Run if you can. Fight if you must. Die if you're weak. The Thunderhawk's engines began cycling up again. Mordrin and Hadrian walked back up the ramp without ceremony, without encouragement, without any indication they expected to see these aspirants again. The hatch sealed. The gunship lifted off. And Cale stood in the frozen wasteland with 7 strangers and the knowledge that in 10 days, maybe 2 of them would still be alive. The first aspirant died on day 2. Cale had been walking for 38 hours straight, rationing his water intake, keeping the mountain fixed in his vision despite the snow that fell in sheets thick enough to blind. He'd learned to read the ice formations, to spot the stable ground versus the crevasses hidden beneath powder snow. He'd learned to walk without thinking, to let his body move on autopilot while his mind focused on survival calculations. He'd learned not to listen to the screaming that echoed across the wastes every few hours. But on day 2 he couldn't ignore it. The scream was too close, too desperate, too obviously coming from one of his cohort. Against every instruction Mordrin had given them, Cale changed direction and ran toward the sound. He found Dorian in a shallow ravine. His leg bent at an angle that made Cale's stomach turn. The boy had fallen 20 meters, hit the ice hard enough to shatter his femur, and now lay in a spreading pool of blood that was already freezing in the -70 temperature. Their eyes met. Dorian's were glassy with shock and pain. "Help me," Dorian whispered. "Please, help me stand. I can make it if I can just—" "If I help you, we both fail," Cale said. The words came out flat. Mechanical. He'd already done the math. Dorian's injury was catastrophic. Even if they splinted it, even if they somehow got him walking again, he'd slow them both down. The infection would set in within hours. He'd be dead in 2 days. "I'll die here," Dorian said. "Yes. You're just going to leave me?" Cale looked at the broken boy in the ice and felt nothing. The Schola had trained them too well. Emotion was weakness. Hesitation was death. Mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. "I'm sorry," Cale said, and meant it. Then he turned and walked away, Dorian's screams following him for the next 3 kilometers until the wind finally drowned them out. He didn't look back. Looking back would change nothing. On day 4, Cale encountered his first Ice WRM. The clicking started an hour after sunset, when he'd been trying to find shelter in an ice cave he'd carved with his combat knife. Click, click, click. Rhythmic and precise, bouncing off the walls of the cave with perfect echo. The bioluminescence came next, a pale blue glow that seemed to seep through the ice itself. The WYRM entered the cave slowly, its segmented body undulating like a massive centipede. Each section plated in scales that looked like frozen armor. It was 7 meters long, maybe 8. Its head was eyeless. It didn't need eyes in the perpetual darkness. but the mouth was a nightmare of concentric rings lined with teeth that rotated like a drill. Cale pressed himself against the back wall of the cave, thermal cloak wrapped tight, knife in hand, controlling his breathing. The clicking intensified. The WRM's head swiveled back and forth, searching. Its heat-sensing organs would be tracking the thermal signature bleeding through his cloak, trying to pinpoint his exact location. The creature surged forward. Cale rolled left, the teeth missing his face by centimeters, the wind from its passage cold enough to freeze the moisture in his eyes. He slashed with the knife, aiming for the softer tissue between the plates, felt the blade bite deep, felt warm fluid spray across his hand. The WRM shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and whipped its body around with horrifying speed. The tail caught Cale in the ribs, lifted him off the ground, slammed him into the cave wall hard enough to crack bone. His vision went white. His lungs forgot how to work. But his hand still gripped the knife, muscle memory from 10,000 training hours, refusing to let go even when his brain was screaming to just lie down and let the cold take him. He stabbed again, targeting the same wound, driving the blade deeper each time, until his entire arm was slick with the WRM's blood and his own. The creature's movements grew sluggish, erratic. One more strike through what he hoped was its brain cluster, and it finally went still. Cale collapsed next to the corpse, breathing in gasps that sent knives through his ribs. Pretty sure he'd broken at least 3 of them. The rational part of his mind was already calculating. He had WRM meat now. Enough protein to last the rest of the trial if he preserved it right. And the thermal properties of the creature's hide would make a better cloak than the thin synthetic one he'd been issued. He spent the next 6 hours butchering the WRM by the glow of its own bioluminescence. Every movement an exercise in agony. Every breath a reminder that he was still 4 days from the fortress gates. Still alone. Still running the calculations on whether his body would hold together long enough to make it. On day 7, Cale found the 3rd body. It was frozen into the ice of a crevasse, arms reaching upward like it had been trying to claw its way out. The face was unrecognizable, but the Skola tattoo on the corpse's neck marked it as one of their cohort. Cale didn't know which one, didn't particularly care. The dead were dead. Counting them changed nothing. But standing there, looking at what had once been a boy who'd probably believed he was going to make it, who'd probably fought and suffered and done everything right before the ice finally claimed him, Cale felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with his broken ribs. He kept walking. On day 9, he saw the fortress gates. They rose out of the ice like the bones of some ancient god, black adamantium carved with devotional texts in High Gothic, each letter 3 meters tall. The gates were open, had been open the entire time, Cale realized, because this was never about reaching a locked door. It was about whether you had enough left in you to cross the threshold. He crossed it 3 hours before the deadline. Brother Apothecary Hadrian was waiting in the entrance hall. So was one other aspirant, a girl Cale vaguely remembered from the landing pad, her face hollow with exhaustion and frostbite. 2 survivors, Hadrian said, making a note on his data slate. Within expected parameters. Congratulations. You've proven you're strong enough to not die immediately. Now we find out if you're strong enough to survive what comes next. Cale wanted to ask what came next. Wanted to demand explanations, reassurance, some acknowledgement that he'd done something incredible just by making it this far. Instead, he said, "When do we begin?" Hadrian's smile was the expression of a man who'd heard that question hundreds of times before and never enjoyed the answer he had to give. You already have. The first surgery happened on day 13. Cale had spent 4 days in the fortress monastery undergoing what Hadrian called preliminary assessments, blood tests, genetic sequencing, psychological evaluations conducted by servitors whose questions made him wonder if madness was a requirement or a disqualifier. Compatibility screening to determine whether his body would accept the foreign organs that were about to be forcibly integrated into his system. Everything came back positive. 97% genetic compatibility with their chapter's gene seed. Psychological profile within acceptable parameters for hypnoconditioning. Physical structure optimized for rapid growth acceleration. He was, in Hadrian's words, as close to perfect as we're likely to find. It didn't feel like a compliment. Felt like a diagnosis. The girl from the trial, Celine, he'd learned her name had only 84% compatibility. Hadrian explained this meant she'd experience more rejection, more corrective surgeries, more risk of catastrophic failure. But 84% was still above the minimum threshold, so she'd proceed. Cale asked what happened to aspirants who fell below the threshold. Hadrian showed him the servitor pits. Lobotomized, cyborgized, reprogrammed to serve in whatever capacity their remaining biological components could support. The chapter wasted nothing. If you weren't suitable for transformation into an Astartes, you could still be useful as a walking maintenance system, a cogitator interface, a biological weapons platform. The mind wasn't required for those functions. Just the meat. Do they know? Cale had asked, staring at a servitor that had once been an aspirant, now shuffling through the halls with empty eyes and mechadendrites where its arms should have been. Know what? That they used to be human. Hadrian considered this. No. The lobotomy removes that capacity. They exist purely in the moment, executing whatever command protocol has been uploaded to their neural lattice. There's no memory, no suffering, no consciousness of what they've lost. That's worse than death. Yes, Hadrian agreed. But it's still service to the Emperor. And in the Imperium, service is all that matters. Now, strapped to the surgical slab in the apothecarian with restraints that would hold even if he had the strength to break ceramite, Cale tried to remember that philosophy. Service was all that matters. Becoming a space marine was the highest calling a human could achieve. Suffering was just the price of transcendence. The rationalization didn't help when Hadrian activated the first incision beam. The secondary heart, Hadrian explained, his voice echoing through the apothecarian's Vox system. Phase 1 of 19. This is actually the simplest implant. A redundant cardiac system that will boost your blood flow, allow you to survive massive trauma, ensure you can keep fighting even if your primary heart is destroyed. The incision beam cut through skin and muscle with surgical precision, guided by Hadrian's servoarm while his actual hands prepared the gene-cultured organ waiting in its suspension fluid. Cale could see it through his peripheral vision. A small, gray thing that looked like a diseased fist, pulsing with its own terrible life. You'll be conscious for every stage of this surgery, Hadrian continued. The catalepsian node requires you to be awake for proper integration. Your brain needs to actively process the trauma so the hypnoconditioning can properly reinforce the pain response. Anesthetic would interfere with that process. Cale wanted to scream that this was insane, that no human being should have to be awake while someone carved open their chest and shoved foreign organs inside, that there had to be another way. But he'd stopped being human the moment he crossed the fortress gates. And the Imperium hadn't survived 10,000 years by choosing easier ways. The secondary heart went in first. Hadrian placed it with the care of an artist positioning a brushstroke, then began connecting it to Cale's existing cardiovascular system with threads of synthetic tissue that bonded at the cellular level. Each connection point felt like someone had injected molten metal directly into his veins. There, Hadrian said after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. It's beating. Your body is already trying to reject it, which is normal. The immunosuppressant cocktail I injected should prevent catastrophic rejection, but you'll experience fever, nausea, internal hemorrhaging, and quite possibly organ failure over the next 72 hours. If you survive that, we'll move to phase 2. If you survive, not when. Hadrian began sealing the incision with bioadhesive that burned like acid where it touched raw flesh. Cale's vision had gone gray around the edges, his mind fragmenting under the assault of sensory input that his brain couldn't properly process. He was aware of Hadrian unhooking him from the surgical slab, aware of being dragged to a recovery cell, aware of a servitor attaching monitoring cables to his chest and scalp. Then he was aware of nothing except pain. The fever started 6 hours later. His temperature spiked to 41 degrees Celsius, hot enough that the servitors had to pack his body in cooling gel to prevent brain damage. His new secondary heart was beating erratically, sometimes racing at 300 beats per minute, sometimes slowing to nothing for 10-second intervals that made the medical monitors scream warnings. Cale drifted in and out of consciousness, caught between nightmares that felt more real than the recovery cell and moments of clarity that were somehow worse. During one lucid period, he heard Hadrian discussing his case with another apothecary. Rejection response is within parameters, but elevated. Lymphatic stress is approaching critical. If he crashes in the next 12 hours, we'll lose him. And the other one? Celine? Already crashed twice. We resuscitated her both times, but she's showing signs of neural degradation. The gene seed is attacking her cognitive centers. If it continues, we'll have to terminate and salvage what we can. Unfortunate. She had potential. They all have potential. That's why we select them. Cale wanted to vomit, partly from the nausea that came with his body trying to cannibalize the secondary heart, partly from the casual way they discussed Celine's imminent death. Like she was just data on a spreadsheet. Just another failed experiment. But that's what they all were, wasn't it? Experiments. Test subjects for a process that had been refined over 10 millennia and still killed 7 out of 10 aspirants. The difference between success and failure wasn't skill or determination. It was genetics, luck, the capricious choice of whether your cells decided to accept the foreign tissue or destroy it. He survived the first 72 hours. Barely. His fever finally broke on the 4th day, leaving him weak and trembling but alive. The secondary heart had integrated enough that his body stopped trying to kill it. Hadrian ran diagnostics, declared him stable, and immediately began preparations for Phase 2. The osmodula, Hadrian explained. This will be significantly worse than the heart. We're going to inject gene seed directly into your skeletal system. It will cause your bones to begin breaking down and reforming, absorbing ceramic compounds from the enhanced diet you'll be on. The process takes months and will be among the most painful experiences of your life. Cale's voice was rough from disuse when he asked, "How painful? You'll wish you died on Talos for." They injected the osmodula that afternoon. Hadrian hadn't been exaggerating. The pain started as a dull ache in his long bones. Femurs, tibias, humeri, then intensified over the following days into something that felt like his skeleton was being dissolved in acid. His bones were breaking down at the cellular level, the old calcium matrix destroyed and replaced with something denser, stronger, reinforced with the ceramic compounds Hadrian force-fed him through a feeding tube. He couldn't walk, couldn't stand. Every movement sent fractures through bones that were simultaneously too weak and too rigid. The medical servitors kept him immobilized in a suspension frame, his body floating in null-gravity gel while the transformation continued. Through the haze of agony, Cale became aware of other sounds in the recovery ward. Screaming from the cell next to his. Celine, he thought. Still alive, still fighting, still experiencing whatever hell her own transformation was putting her through. The screaming stopped on day 7. Hadrian came by the next morning, making notes on his data slate as he reviewed Cale's progress. "The girl didn't make it," Hadrian said without prompting. "Multiple organ failure. The gene seed triggered a cascade rejection response that liquefied her kidneys. We tried to save her, but," he shrugged, "some bodies simply aren't compatible. She'll be processed into a servitor. Her remaining genetic material will be studied to improve our screening protocols." Cale stared at the ceiling of his cell and said nothing. What was there to say? Celine had been strong enough to survive Talos 4. Strong enough to endure the first implant. But not strong enough to survive having her bones dissolved and rebuilt. That was the arbitrary cruelty of the transformation. You could do everything right and still fail because your cells decided to mutiny. "You're handling the osmodula better than expected," Hadrian continued. "Bone density is increasing at an optimal rate. Growth acceleration is within parameters. You've gained 4 centimeters in height already. By the time we're finished, you'll be over 2 meters tall." "How many more phases?" Cale managed to ask through the pain. 17. And each one gets progressively worse. The Biscopia will require us to chemically induce muscle growth at a rate that will tear your existing musculature apart so it can regrow stronger. The catalepsia node will be implanted directly into your brain, and you'll need to be conscious for that surgery so we can monitor neural integration. The black carapace, the final implant, will require us to flay most of the skin from your body and replace it with a neural interface layer. Hadrian leaned closer, close enough that Cale could see the age lines around his eyes, the scars that marked where his own transformation had left its mark decades ago. You wanted to know when it gets better. I'll tell you now, it doesn't. The transformation breaks you in ways that never fully heal. Your body becomes a weapon, but you pay for that with every nerve ending that gets rewired, every hormone balance that gets chemically altered, every human experience that becomes impossible because you're no longer designed for humanity. Then why do it? Cale whispered. Because the Imperium is dying. Because humanity is surrounded by things that want to exterminate or enslave or devour us. Because someone has to stand between the darkness and the light, and ordinary humans aren't strong enough to hold that line. So we take boys and break them and rebuild them into something that might survive long enough to matter. Hadrian stood, preparing to move on to the next patient. But he paused at the cell door, looking back at Cale with an expression that might have been pity if apothecaries were still capable of such emotions. The suffering never ends, aspirant. You just become better at enduring it. The next 6 months were a blur of surgery and recovery, pain and adaptation, death and survival. Cale lost count of how many implants they'd installed, how many times his body had rejected the gene seed and Hadrian had to cut him open again to manually adjust the integration. He knew the Biscopia had gone in because his muscles began tearing themselves apart and regrowing during sleep cycles, leaving him screaming into the darkness of his cell. He knew the catalepsia node had been installed because he stopped being able to fully sleep, his mind cycling through half-conscious states that blurred the line between rest and waking nightmare. He'd started at 1.7 meters and 61 kilograms. By month 4, he was 2.1 meters and 98 kilograms of muscle and reinforced bone that moved with a power his human brain still wasn't equipped to fully control. He'd broken 3 restraint frames just by stretching during recovery, had shattered a feeding tube by biting down too hard when the pain overwhelmed his control. The aspirant in the cell across from his hadn't been so fortunate. The boy's name had been Lucian, and his neuroglottis, the implant that allowed space marines to gain information by tasting substances, had triggered a catastrophic allergic response. Cale had watched through his cell's observation window as Lucian's throat swelled shut, as the medical servitors rushed in with emergency tracheotomy equipment, as Hadrian made the cold calculation that the aspirant couldn't be saved and injected the termination compound that stopped his hearts. 13 aspirants had begun the transformation cycle this year. 4 remained. Cale, a boy named Tomas who'd survived the Talos trial by eating the corpse of another aspirant. A girl named Petra who'd lost her left arm to frostbite but made it to the gates anyway. And someone Cale had never seen, kept isolated in a different wing of the Apothecarian for reasons Hadrian wouldn't explain. Different chapters have different approaches, Hadrian told him during one of the psycho-conditioning sessions, while hypnotic patterns flashed across screens designed to rewrite his fear responses. Some try to build camaraderie among aspirants. They believe brotherhood makes stronger Marines. We've found the opposite to be true. Isolation during transformation creates warriors who don't hesitate when their battle brothers fall, who understand that duty continues regardless of loss. The conditioning sessions were their own kind of torture. Hours strapped to a reclined chair while images and sounds and electrical impulses rewired the neural pathways that made him human. They were teaching his brain to suppress fear, to override self-preservation instincts, to prioritize mission completion over personal survival. They were turning him into a weapon that could be pointed at any target and trusted to keep firing until either the target was destroyed or he was. Some part of Cale still remembered being 11 years old. Still remembered the boy who'd stood in the Scola courtyard believing he was going to become a hero. That part of him screamed during the conditioning sessions, fought against the hypnotic programming, tried desperately to hold on to something. Recognizably human, that part of him lost a little more every day. By month 7, Cale had stopped recognizing his own reflection. The face that stared back from the polished metal of his cell door belonged to something else. Square jaw reinforced with subdermal plating. Eyes that had taken on an unnatural sharpness from the oculobe implants that rewrote his optic nerves. Skin that had begun developing the tough, leathery texture that would eventually accept the black carapace. He looked like an Astartes, moved like one, thought like one in the cold, tactical way that reduced every situation to threat assessment and force application. But he didn't feel like one, didn't know if he ever would. Because underneath the transhuman strength and the hypno-conditioning and the gene seed rewiring his entire biology, Kale was still aware enough to understand what he'd lost. The final implant, Hadrian announced on day 217. The black carapace. This will be the longest surgery you've endured. 36 hours minimum. We'll be flaying approximately 70% of your dermal layer and replacing it with a synthetic interface that will allow you to bond with power armor. The process requires you to remain conscious so we can verify each neural connection is properly integrated. Kale nodded. He'd stopped questioning, stopped protesting. The transformation had progressed too far to turn back now. Even if they wanted to reverse it, which they wouldn't, removing the implants would kill him. His body had become dependent on the gene seed, on the enhanced organs keeping him alive. He was already more Astartes than human. This was just the final step. They strapped him to the surgical slab at dawn. The last thing Kale saw before they began was his own reflection in the overhead light fixture. Distorted, monstrous, barely recognizable as the child who'd boarded a Thunderhawk 9 months ago. Then Hadrian activated the flaying beam, and Kale's world became nothing but pain and the sound of his own screaming. 36 hours. Every second conscious. Every nerve ending firing as they peeled away skin and muscle and replaced it with the black carapace's synthetic interface. The agony was so complete, so overwhelming, that Kale's mind simply fractured. Part of him remained aware, processing the sensation as valuable data about his pain threshold. Part of him retreated into psycho-conditioning mantras, reciting the catechism of hate in an endless loop. Part of him just screamed. When it was finally over, when Hadrian sealed the last integration point and declared the surgery complete, Kale lay on the slab and stared at the ceiling with eyes that no longer produced tears. His body didn't respond to emotional distress the way human bodies did. The catalepsian nodes suppressed those reactions. The hypno-conditioning redirected them into tactical clarity. He'd survived. For aspirants out of 13, roughly 30%, which Hadrian declared was above-average efficiency for this cycle. The math was simple, brutal, necessary. But as servitors transferred Kale to a recovery cradle and the sedatives finally kicked in, allowing him his first full sleep in months, he dreamed of the boy he'd been. The one who'd believed becoming an Astartes was an honor, who'd thought suffering built character, who'd had no concept of what transformation actually meant. That boy was dead now, burned away by surgery and conditioning and genetic manipulation. In his place was something that wore his memories like ill-fitting clothes, something that could kill with casual efficiency and feel nothing doing it, something that existed solely to serve an Imperium that would use him until he broke and then render his corpse down for gene seed to make the next generation of weapons. When Kale woke from the sedation, Brother Chaplain Mordrin was standing beside his recovery cradle. "Welcome, Brother Scout Kale," Mordrin said. "Your transformation is complete. Your training begins tomorrow." Kale managed a weak nod. His throat was too raw for speech. "Do you understand what you've become?" Mordrin asked. This time, Kale found his voice. It sounded wrong, deeper, harsher, processed through a throat that had been rebuilt for vox communication rather than normal human speech. "I'm a weapon, my lord, forged by suffering, pointed by duty, fired until I break." Mordrin's expression was unreadable behind his skull helm, but something in his posture suggested satisfaction. "Good. You understand. Many don't, even after transformation. They cling to notions of heroism or glory or the Emperor's love. But you see clearly. We are tools. Nothing more. Nothing less. And the Imperium has many, many uses for tools like us." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Your new brothers are waiting. The ones who survived their own transformations, who endured their own suffering, who understand what you've sacrificed. You'll find no comfort among them, no warmth, no human connection that hasn't been chemically suppressed by your implants. But you'll find purpose. And in the endless war we fight, purpose is all we're permitted to have." The door sealed behind him, leaving Kale alone in the recovery cell with his new body and his fractured mind and the terrible knowledge that this wasn't the end of his suffering. It was only the beginning. The training began before his wounds had fully healed. Brother Sergeant Arcturus didn't care that Kale could barely walk without his new musculature cramping. Didn't care that the black carapace integration points still wept bloody fluid where the synthetic interface met his remaining flesh. Didn't care that Kale's mind was still processing the psycho-conditioning, still trying to reconcile his human memories with the tactical computer his brain had been rewired to become. Pain is irrelevant, Arcturus said, standing in the center of the training hall while Kale and the 3 other surviving neophytes struggled through their first combat drill. Your body is a weapon. Weapons don't complain about maintenance. Tomas stumbled during a grappling sequence. Arcturus was on him instantly, one ceramite gauntlet hand gripping the neophyte's throat, lifting him off the ground with casual ease. You hesitated. Hesitation kills. Not just you, but your battle brothers who rely on you to execute your function. Arcturus squeezed, just enough to crush Tomas's trachea, then released him. The neophyte collapsed, choking, while his enhanced physiology repaired the damage. Again. And this time, pretend your life depends on it, because eventually it will. The training regimen was designed to break them again, to take the raw material of their transformed bodies and sculpt it into something that could function in combat without thought, without hesitation, without any of the human limitations that got soldiers killed. They drilled for 18 hours a day. Combat forms, weapons handling, tactical doctrine, chapter history, catechisms of hate and duty and service that they recited while their bodies moved through killing sequences. Sleep came in 4-hour bursts, split by the catalepsian node so half their brain remained alert even during rest. Meals were nutritional paste consumed during marksmanship drills. Social interaction was limited to mission briefings and punishment details. This was their life now. This was all their life would ever be. Kale adapted faster than the others. His genetic compatibility meant his body responded better to the training, his muscles developing the memory patterns Arcturus demanded with fewer repetitions. By week 3, he could field strip and reassemble a bolter in 14 seconds. By week 6, he could put 3 rounds through the same hole at 500 meters. By week 12, he'd killed his first combat servitor in melee training and felt absolutely nothing doing it. That was when he knew the transformation was complete. Not because of what his body could do, but because of what his mind had stopped caring about. Petra struggled more. Her missing arm, lost to frostbite during the Talos trial, had been replaced with a bionic limb, but the neural integration was imperfect. She was 0.3 seconds slower in drawing her weapon, 0.6 seconds slower in target acquisition. In normal human combat, the difference wouldn't matter. Among Astartes, it was the line between life and death. Arcturus noticed, of course. He noticed everything. You're compromised, he told her during an evaluation session. A liability to any squad that accepts you. The chapter has standards. You no longer meet them. Petra stood at attention, her face expressionless. But Kale could see the microtremors in her jaw, could read the telltale signs of stress hormones her body was trying to suppress. I can improve, Brother Sergeant. Give me more time. You'll what? Regrow the arm? Reverse genetic damage from frostbite exposure? The implants can work miracles, neophyte, but they can't fix fundamental incompatibility. Arcturus consulted his data slate. You have 2 options. Continue as a chapter serf, serving in whatever capacity your remaining abilities allow, or accept reassignment to a penal legion where your enhanced physiology might still be useful before you're inevitably killed. There's no third option? Petra's voice was steady, but Kale heard the desperation underneath. There is, actually. Arcturus gestured to the apothecary standing in the corner of the training hall. Brother Hadrian stepped forward, and Kale felt his primary heart rate spike. Nothing good ever came from Hadrian appearing unannounced. Your gene seed is still viable, Hadrian explained. Still potentially useful for future aspirants. We could harvest it now, rather than waiting for combat death or old age. Your service to the chapter would end, but your genetic legacy would continue. Petra looked between Arcturus and Hadrian, understanding finally settling across her features. They were offering her a clean death, a final service, the chance to at least contribute something meaningful instead of living as a failed space marine. "I accept," she said after only a moment's hesitation. Hadrian nodded, already preparing the extraction tools. "It'll be quick, and painless if you prefer. Though given your training, you'll probably want to remain conscious for it." "I do." They performed the extraction right there in the training hall. The other neophytes watched as Hadrian cut Petra open with surgical precision, removed the progenoid glands that carried the chapter's precious gene seed, and sealed the wounds that would never heal. Watched as Petra's enhanced physiology finally acknowledged the catastrophic trauma and shut down. Watched as another aspirant who'd survived trials and transformation and months of brutal training became just another statistic. Arcturus made them continue drilling while Petra's body was carried away. "She understood the reality of our existence," he said. "She wasn't strong enough to continue, so she made the choice that served the chapter best. That's the level of dedication expected of all of you. Your lives matter only insofar as they can be spent efficiently in the Emperor's service." Tomas had stopped moving, staring at the blood on the training hall floor. "Something wrong, neophyte?" Arcturus asked. "She was one of us. We survived together. And now she's just gone." Arcturus backhanded him with enough force to crack the neophyte's cheekbone. "She was never one of us. She was a candidate who failed to meet standards. You will see 10,000 brothers die over your service career, if you're fortunate enough to live that long. You will see them torn apart by Xenos, corrupted by chaos, consumed by war's infinite variations of death. If you hesitate or grieve or allow their deaths to compromise your combat effectiveness, you'll join them. Is that understood?" "Yes, Brother Sergeant." "Prove it. Combat trial. You versus Kale. First blood. Begin." They fought for 11 minutes. Tomas had size advantage, had integrated the Biscopia better, developed more muscle mass. But Kale had precision, speed, the cold tactical clarity that came from fully accepting what he'd become. When Kale's training blade opened Tomas's throat in a textbook disabling strike, Arcturus nodded approval. "Better. You're starting to understand. Your battle brothers are tools, same as you. Useful tools deserve maintenance and preservation. Broken tools get replaced. There's no sentiment in it. No emotion. Just function." Kale helped Tomas to his feet, watched the wound seal as the Laraman cells did their work, and felt absolutely nothing about the blood on his hands. The indoctrination continued for another 6 months. 18 hours a day of combat drills, tactical simulations, psycho-conditioning that reinforced the neural pathways they'd spent transformation building. They learned chapter history, not the propaganda fed to Imperial citizens, but the actual casualty reports, the missions where entire companies had been wiped out, the dark truths about how the chapter maintained its strength through constant recruitment because the attrition rate was catastrophic. They learned that their average combat lifespan was 8.3 years. Some lasted longer. Veterans who made it to a century of service were venerated as near legends. Most died far sooner. Their first combat deployment. Their third. Their 17th. The numbers didn't matter. The deaths did, but only because each death meant the chapter had to invest resources in creating a replacement. Kale absorbed it all with the same mechanical efficiency he'd developed for everything else. The hypno-conditioning had rewired his emotional responses so completely that he could review casualty statistics for his own future with the detachment of a tech priest analyzing maintenance schedules. 60% chance of death in first combat deployment. 85% within 5 years. 96% within 10. The two who'd made it past a century? Statistical outliers. Interesting data points. Nothing more. Brother Chaplain Mordrin visited the neophytes during their final month of indoctrination. He brought them to the chapter's reclusium, the sacred space where the chapter's honored dead were memorialized. Thousands of name plaques covered the walls. Tens of thousands. Each one representing a battle brother who'd served and died and been reduced to a metal rectangle with their name and service dates. "This is your future," Mordrin said, his voice echoing through the cathedral-like space. Every brother in this room will eventually have their name added to these walls. The only question is whether you'll earn glory before you die, or simply become another forgotten casualty in humanity's endless war. Cale studied the plaques, calculated the average service duration. 12.4 years from initiation to death. Some lasted decades. Most didn't make it past their first year as full battle brothers. Do you understand now why we break you during transformation? Mordrin continued. Why we strip away your humanity, your emotions, your capacity for fear. Because if you truly comprehended what awaited you, the mathematical certainty of violent death, the horror of the things you'll fight, the price your service demands, you'd break. So we break you first. Rebuild you into something that can function despite knowing the truth. He turned to face them directly, the death's head mask of his chaplain helm seeming to peer into their souls. You are already dead. You died on Talos for, or during transformation, or the first time you truly understood what you've become. What walks and fights and bleeds in your place is just a weapon wearing the memory of a human child. The sooner you accept this, the more effective you'll be. The words should have been devastating, should have broken something fundamental in Cale's psyche. But the hypno-conditioning did its job. The truth settled into his mind like a bolt sliding home in a gun's chamber. Clean, mechanical, inevitable. He was already dead. Had been dead since the moment he crossed those fortress gates 9 months ago. Everything since then had just been the Imperium reanimating his corpse and teaching it how to kill. The final test came during their last week of training. Arcturus led the 3 remaining neophytes, Cale, Tomas, and a silent aspirant named Corvus who barely spoke but moved with eerie precision, into the chapter's combat simulation chambers. The room was the size of a small hive district, equipped with hololithic projectors that could recreate any battlefield environment. Live fire exercise, Arcturus explained. You'll face a simulated orc assault. Real bolter rounds, real combat servitors modified to approximate orc physiology and tactics. Real consequences if you fail. He activated the simulation. The chamber transformed into a ruined cityscape, smoke and dust filling the air, the sound of distant artillery creating atmospheric pressure that made their ears pop. Objective: hold the central plaza for 30 minutes against continuous assault. Rules of engagement: kill anything that isn't wearing your colors. Failure parameters: if any of you dies, the others fail. If you allow the orcs to take the plaza, you all fail. Success parameters: survive and complete the objective with acceptable efficiency. Arcturus stepped back into a shielded observation booth. The doors sealed, and the orcs came. Not real orcs. Cale's Tactical Assessment Center identified them as combat servitors with hololithic overlays and programmed aggression protocols. But they moved like orcs, roared like orcs, fired weapons that produced very real wounds when they connected. The first wave hit 30 seconds after the simulation began. 20 servitor orcs, charging with the mindless violence their Xenos counterparts were famous for. Cale dropped 3 with controlled bursts from his bolter, watched their heads explode in showers of bone and synth flesh, and felt nothing except satisfaction at his 97% accuracy. Tomas took position on his left, creating a crossfire pattern. Corvus moved to high ground, providing overwatch and precision shots that dropped targets before they could close to melee range. They functioned as a unit. No communication needed. Their tactical implants synchronized their awareness automatically, creating a shared combat consciousness that let them fight as a single organism with 3 bodies. The second wave was larger, 40 orcs. The third was 60. By the 10th wave, the plaza was choked with servitor corpses and spent brass, and Cale's bolter had cycled through 3 magazines. Tomas took a round to the shoulder, kept fighting. Corvus got tackled by an orc that made it through their firing pattern, crushed its skull with his bare hands, kept fighting. Cale's armor registered 17 impacts, none penetrating his black carapace but each one adding to the cumulative damage his body was absorbing. 30 minutes. Exactly 30 minutes after the simulation began, the orc assault stopped. The hololithic overlays faded. The combat servitors powered down. And 3 neophytes stood in a plaza full of synthetic corpses, breathing hard but alive, their armor scorched and dented but functional. Arcturus emerged from the observation booth, studying his data slate. "Acceptable," he said. The word carried more weight than any praise. "You fought as a unit, adapted to changing threat parameters, maintained combat effectiveness despite casualties. You've proven you can function under fire." He paused, letting the evaluation sink in. "Tomorrow you'll be elevated to full scout status. You'll be assigned to a veteran squad for your first combat deployment. They'll take you somewhere where the enemy is real and the consequences are permanent. Most of you won't survive your first year, but you've proven your worth, the investment of sending you into combat before you die." That night, in the barracks they shared with other scout neophytes, Cale lay in his bunk and processed what Arcturus had said. Tomorrow they'd be full battle brothers. Tomorrow their training would end and their service would begin. Tomorrow they'd step onto the path that led inevitably to their names being carved on plaques in the reclusium. He should have felt pride, or fear, or something. Instead, he felt only the cold certainty that came from complete indoctrination. He was a weapon. Weapons didn't have feelings about being used. They just functioned until they broke. Tomas's voice came from the bunk above. "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it?" "Worth what?" "All of it. The trials. The transformation. Becoming this." Tomas's hand appeared over the edge of his bunk, examining the fingers that could crush steel. "Giving up being human." Cale considered the question with his tactical assessment center, analyzing it for logical coherence. "We were going to die anyway, at the Scola or in some Imperial Guard regiment, or in the Underhive where most orphans end up. This way, our deaths serve a purpose. That's not the same as being worth it." "No," Cale agreed. "But worth is a human concept. We're not human anymore. We're weapons. And weapons don't get to decide if they're worth using." Tomas went quiet after that. Cale lay in the darkness, listening to his enhanced hearing pick up sounds from across the fortress monastery. The distant hum of plasma reactors. The prayers of chaplains in the reclusium. The screams of new aspirants undergoing transformation in the apothecarian. Somewhere in that building, boys were dying to become what Cale already was. And more would come after them. And more after that. An endless cycle of suffering and transformation and death, all in service to an Imperium that consumed its warriors as fuel for a war that would never end. He closed his eyes, though the catalepsian node meant he'd never truly sleep again, and accepted his place in that cycle. Tomorrow, the dying would begin in earnest. The Thunderhawk's troop base smelled like recycled air, gun oil, and the subtle wrong scent that came from ceramite armor bonding with power cores. Cale had been in combat armor for 6 hours now, feeling the black carapace interface points connect his nervous system to the suit's machine spirit, turning the armor into a second skin that moved with his thoughts rather than his muscles. It should have felt empowering. Instead, it felt like being buried alive in a walking coffin. Across from him, veteran Sergeant Cato stood locked into the Thunderhawk's mag restraints, reviewing tactical data on his helmet's visor display. The veteran had been with the chapter for 43 years, had survived 17 major campaigns, was walking statistical proof that some Astartes beat the odds and lived past their expected expiration date. The rest of Squad Cato was equally experienced. Brother Valen, 51 years of service, his armor scarred with acid burns from fighting Tyranids. Brother Marcus, 32 years, one bionic eye to replace the one he'd lost to an orc choppa. Brother Soren, 28 years, cybernetic legs after a landmine had taken the original ones. And then there were the scouts, Cale, Tomas, and Corvus. 48 hours out of training. Total combat experience, 0. Life expectancy in their first deployment. Approximately 68% mortality rate according to chapter statistics. First combat is always the worst, Sergeant Cato said, his vox-modulated voice cutting through the Thunderhawk's engine roar. You'll want to freeze, to overthink, to process the enormity of what you're experiencing. Don't. Your training will take over if you let it. Trust your gene enhancements. Trust your conditioning. Trust that you've been built specifically to function in conditions that would destroy human soldiers. The Thunderhawk shuddered as it entered atmosphere. Outside, the world of Kardashian 3 was burning. Orc invasion, 6 months in progress, the local Astra Militarum forces ground down to nothing. Squad Cato's mission was simple. Deploy to grid reference theta. 4. Eliminate the Orc war boss coordinating the assault. Extract before the greenskin reinforcements arrived. Simple. Not easy. 30 seconds. The pilot Vox Ed. Landing zone is hot. Expect immediate contact. Kale's primary heart rate increased to 80 beats per minute. His secondary heart kicked in automatically, flooding his system with combat stimulants his enhanced adrenal glands produced on demand. Time seemed to slow slightly as his catalepsian node processed sensory input faster than human brains could manage. The Thunderhawk's rear ramp dropped. Daylight and smoke and the stench of burning promethium flooded the troop bay. And beneath it all, the smell of orcs. Fungus and sweat and something metallic that reminded Kale of corroded iron. For the Emperor and the Chapter, Sergeant Cato roared and led them into hell. The landing zone was a ruined manufacturing complex, its adamantium framework twisted by artillery and its floors slick with what Kale's autosenses identified as human blood. The orcs were waiting. Not in organized positions, orcs didn't do organized, but scattered through the ruins in clusters that would converge once the shooting started. Kale's first kill came 3 seconds after his boots hit ground. An orc, smaller than he'd expected but still massive by human standards, charged from behind a collapsed wall with a pistol in one hand and a jagged blade in the other. Kale's bolter was up and firing before his conscious mind finished processing the threat. 3 rounds. Center mass. The mass-reactive shells detonated inside the Xenos, blowing out its spine and most of its internal organs. It kept coming for another 2 steps before its brain registered that it was dead. Kale fired again. Headshot this time. The orc skull came apart like rotten fruit. The body finally collapsed. His tactical implants were already tracking the next target. And the next. His hands moved through reload sequences his muscle memory had drilled 10,000 times. His awareness expanded to include his squadmates' positions, the enemy attack vectors, the structural weak points in the manufactorum that could be exploited for cover or collapse. He was functioning. No fear. No hesitation. Just the cold mechanical process of identifying threats and eliminating them with maximum efficiency. This was what they built him for. Tomas was struggling. Kale registered it through his tactical awareness net. The other scout's firing pattern was erratic, his movements too slow. An orc got inside his guard, and Tomas barely blocked the blade stroke that would have opened his throat. Would have been fatal if Brother Marcus hadn't put a bolt round through the orc's temple. "Steady, scout," Marcus Vox said. "Stop thinking and start killing." The firefight lasted 8 minutes. Approximately 40 orcs dead. Squad Cato suffered minimal damage. Soren took a slugga round to his thigh armor, denting the ceramite but not penetrating. Corvus lost 2 fingers to an orc blade before killing his attacker. The digits were still attached by threads of black carapace. He'd need an apothecary to properly reattach them, but the injury barely slowed him. Kale had fired 63 rounds, scored 58 confirmed kills. 7% over the chapter's expected accuracy for scout-class marksmen in their first engagement. He felt nothing about it. No pride, no horror, just acknowledgement of data. Target building is 300 meters northeast. Sergeant Cato Vox Ed, highlighting the structure on their shared tactical display. Intel suggests the war boss is coordinating from there. We go in fast, eliminate the target, extract before they can organize a counterattack. They moved through the ruins in combat formation, Kale and the other scouts taking point while the veterans covered their advance. The orcs tried to mount resistance twice more. Both times, Squad Cato cut through them like a chainsword through flesh. By the time they reached the target building, Kale had killed another 16 Xenos. His bolter was cycling low ammunition warnings. His armor had taken 7 direct hits, none penetrating but the cumulative damage stressing the ceramite plating. And somewhere in the back of his enhanced consciousness, a tiny voice that might have been his human mind was screaming about the impossibility of what he was doing. He ignored it. Screaming voices didn't matter. Mission completion did. The war boss was exactly where intelligence had predicted. A massive orc, easily 3 meters tall, covered in crude bionics and trophies taken from the Imperial Guard soldiers it had killed. It was bellowing orders into a Vox unit cobbled together from Imperial and orc technology, coordinating the assault on the last Guard stronghold. It looked up when Squad Cato breached the building, grinned with tusks that had been filed to points, and charged with the kind of berserk fury that made orcs so dangerous despite their primitive technology. Scouts, suppressing fire, Sergeant Cato ordered. Veterans, converge and eliminate. Kale's bolter barked in controlled bursts, the rounds exploding against the warboss's thick hide but failing to punch through the crude armor plating underneath. Tomas and Corvus added their fire, creating a storm of mass-reactive shells that would have shredded anything smaller. The war boss kept coming. Killed Brother Soren with a single swing of its power claw, the energy field cutting through ceramite and enhanced flesh and bone like they were paper. Crushed Brother Valen's helmet with its offhand, pulping the veteran's skull inside his armor. Kale watched 2 battle brothers die in the span of 3 seconds and felt his hypno-conditioning suppress any emotional response. His tactical implants simply recalculated the squad's combat effectiveness and flagged the mission. Parameters as still achievable despite casualties. Sergeant Cato put his power sword through the warboss's throat. Brother Marcus followed with a crock grenade stuffed into the Xenos' mouth. The resulting detonation took the warboss's head off and collapsed part of the building's ceiling. Mission accomplished, Cato voxed. His voice was flat, professional. 2 of his brothers had just died, and his response was to confirm mission completion. Extract to the landing zone. Move. They moved. Left Soren and Valen's bodies where they'd fallen. Recovery wasn't part of the mission parameters. The chapter would send a recovery team later if time permitted, but right now staying alive took priority over honoring the dead. The run back to the Thunderhawk was a nightmare. Orc reinforcements were flooding into the area, hundreds of the greenskins converging on the Manufactorum complex. Squad Cato fought a running battle, stopping only long enough to clear obstacles before pushing forward again. Tomas took a round to the spine, kept running despite his legs going numb. Corvus lost his arm at the elbow to an orc choppa, grabbed the detached limb with his remaining hand and kept fighting. Kale's armor finally failed at the shoulder joint, exposing the black carapace and the muscle beneath. An orc slugga round punched through the gap, shattering his clavicle and lodging in the meat of his shoulder. His Laraman cells went to work immediately, clotting the wound, but the pain was overwhelming even through his enhanced pain tolerance. Kale stumbled, nearly went down, felt Brother Marcus grab him and half-drag half-carry him toward the Thunderhawk. Stay conscious, Scout. That's an order. Kale stayed conscious, watched the Thunderhawk's boarding ramp through vision that was graying at the edges. Watched Sergeant Cato lay down covering fire while Marcus hauled him aboard. Watched Corvus follow, still clutching his severed arm, his blood painting a trail across the deck plating. Watched Tomas, 10 meters from safety, take 3 slugga rounds to the back. Watched him try to keep running. Watched him collapse face-first into the dirt. We have to go back, Kale tried to say, but Marcus was already strapping him into the medical restraints. He's combat ineffective, Sergeant Cato said, boarding the Thunderhawk. Extract now. That's final. The ramp sealed. The Thunderhawk lifted off. And through the viewport, Kale watched Tomas raise one hand toward the departing gunship before the orcs closed over him like a green tide. They left him. Just left him. Casualties. Brothers Soren and Valen, confirmed Kia. Sergeant Cato reported to Chapter Command via Vox. Scouts Corvus and Kale, injured but stable. Scout Tomas, MIA presumed dead. Mission accomplished. War boss eliminated. Requesting immediate medical support upon return to battle barge. Kale lay in the medical restraints, his shoulder bleeding through the emergency compress Marcus had applied, and tried to process what had just happened. They'd lost 3 brothers. 3. And Sergeant Cato was filing a mission accomplished report like they'd just completed a training exercise. First combat is always the worst, Cato had said. He'd been right, But not for the reasons Cale had expected. The killing wasn't the worst part. The danger wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding that this would be his entire existence. Deploy. Fight. Watch brothers die. Complete the mission. Deploy again. An endless cycle until his own name joined the plaques in the reclusium. And feeling absolutely nothing about it except cold tactical acceptance. Welcome to the chapter, Scout, Brother Marcus said quietly, checking Cale's vitals on the medical monitor. You survived your first deployment. Statistically, that puts you in the top 40%. Congratulations. Cale stared at the ceiling of the Thunderhawk's medical bay and said nothing. What was there to say? That Tomas had been his brother? That they'd survived the trials together? That leaving him felt wrong? None of that mattered. Tomas had become combat ineffective. The mission had required immediate extract. Staying would have risked the entire squad. The decision was simple mathematics. The hypno-conditioning said so. The tactical implants said so. Every piece of his transhuman psychology said so. So why did some small, dying part of his human mind keep screaming that they should have gone back? The medical bay's lights flickered as the Thunderhawk cleared atmosphere. Cale closed his eyes, knowing the catalepsian node meant he wouldn't actually sleep, and tried to quiet that screaming voice. It didn't work. He suspected it never would. 10 years. Cale had been a full battle brother of the chapter for 10 years. He'd survived long enough to beat the statistics that said he should have died 8 years ago. Had been promoted from scout to full battle brother after his 4th successful deployment. Had earned his first commendation after holding a trench line against a Tyranid assault for 16 hours straight. Had killed so many enemies in so many wars that he'd stopped counting somewhere around the 4,000 mark. He was, by any measure, a successful space marine, a valuable asset to the chapter, a weapon that had proven its worth through a decade of continuous combat. And he was absolutely, fundamentally broken. The cracks had started small. Minor things he could dismiss as battlefield stress or imperfect psychoconditioning. Dreams during the brief sleep cycles his catalepsian node allowed. Dreams where he was 11 years old again and standing in the Scola courtyard making the choice that had led him here. Moments of hesitation, microseconds barely measurable, before pulling the trigger on targets his tactical implants had already identified as hostile. The wrongness of enjoying the taste of real food instead of just processing it as fuel. The dreams got worse, more frequent, started bleeding into his waking hours in ways that should have been impossible with his enhanced mental conditioning. He'd be in combat, functioning with perfect efficiency, and suddenly he'd remember Tomas reaching toward the Thunderhawk. Remember Petra accepting death with quiet dignity. Remember the boy he'd been before they'd burned it all away. Brother Apothecary Hadrian noticed first. Of course he did. Apothecaries noticed everything. Your combat effectiveness is declining, Hadrian said during a routine medical examination. 0.03% across all measurable parameters. Negligible by normal standards, but concerning given your previous performance levels. I'm functioning within acceptable ranges, Cale replied. Well above the chapter minimum. That's not the point. Hadrian consulted his data slate, scrolling through years of medical data. You're experiencing what we call conditioning degradation. It's rare. Most battle brothers die before it becomes significant. But it happens sometimes to those who survive long enough. The hypno-conditioning starts to break down. The psychological barriers we installed during transformation begin to fail. Can it be reconditioned? Yes. We'd need to take you through another round of psychotherapy. Reinforce the neural pathways. Suppress the emerging emotional responses. Basically rebuild what's starting to crack. Hadrian paused, and something in his expression was almost human. Almost the man he might have been before his own transformation. But I need to ask you a question first. And I need you to answer honestly. Do you want to be reconditioned? Cale stared at the apothecary. The question didn't make sense. Wanting wasn't relevant. He was a space marine. A weapon. Weapons didn't get wants. They had functions, and they were maintained to perform those functions with maximum efficiency. I don't understand the question, he said. Yes, you do. You've been a battle brother for 10 years. You've seen what we are, what we do, what it costs. The conditioning is breaking down because some part of you, whatever survived the transformation, is starting to reject what you've become. So I'm asking, do you want me to suppress that part again? Or do you want to live with it? Kale considered. His tactical implants tried to process the question logically, but this wasn't a tactical problem. This was something else. Something the implants weren't designed to handle. If I don't get reconditioned, what happens? You'll continue to experience increasing emotional responses. Doubt, grief, guilt about the things you've done and the brothers you've lost. Eventually it'll compromise your combat effectiveness enough that you'll be a liability. You'll either die in combat because you hesitated, or you'll be retired to serve in some support capacity, or... Hadrian trailed off. Or you'll do what Brother Sergeant Dravos did 6 months ago. Put a bolt round through your own skull because living with full awareness of what you are became unbearable. The words hit Kale with the force of a plasma blast. Dravos had been a veteran. 73 years of service. Had survived things that would have broken entire guard regiments. And he'd killed himself? The chapter doesn't talk about it, Hadrian continued. Officially, Dravos died in combat. But I was the one who found his body. I was the one who had to harvest his gene seed and write a report explaining why a veteran brother chose death over continuing service. Hadrian set down his data slate and looked directly at Kale, and for just a moment the mask of the transhuman apothecary slipped enough to show the man underneath. I'm breaking protocol telling you this. The chapter prefers we maintain the illusion that our conditioning is perfect, that every brother serves with unwavering dedication until they die gloriously in battle. But it's not true. Some of us crack. Some of us start remembering what it meant to be human, and the weight of what we've lost becomes too much to carry. Why tell me this? Kale asked. Because you deserve to make an informed choice. I can recondition you. Make you forget this conversation. Make you forget the doubts and the dreams and the wrongness you're starting to feel. You'll be an efficient weapon again. You'll serve the chapter without question until you die. Or you can refuse and accept the consequences of living with awareness. What did you choose? Hadrian smiled, and it was possibly the saddest expression Kale had ever seen on a Space Marine's face. I chose awareness. 51 years ago when my own conditioning started breaking. And I've regretted it every single day since. Kale sat in silence, processing, trying to calculate the right choice, the logical choice, the choice that served the chapter and the Emperor and humanity's endless war. But for the first time in 10 years, he found himself caring less about what was logical and more about what was true. I want to know something first, he said. All of it. Every truth the chapter hides. What we really are. What the transformation really costs. All of it. And then I'll make my decision. Hadrian studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Come with me. They went deep into the battle barge's archives, past the sacred armories and the reclusium and the training halls where new scouts learned to kill. Went to a section Kale had never accessed, where the chapter kept records that ordinary battle brothers weren't meant to see. Hadrian pulled up files on a hololith display, casualty reports, medical data, psychological assessments, the raw, unfiltered truth about what Space Marines actually were. The transformation has a 68% mortality rate during the implantation process, Hadrian began. Another 23% die during the first 5 years of combat. Of those who survive past 5 years, 41% develop severe psychological trauma that requires reconditioning or termination. The average service life is 12 years. 1 in every 15 battle brothers will eventually attempt suicide. 1 in 8 will suffer catastrophic gene seed rejection and require servitor conversion. He pulled up another file. Images of failed transformations. Bodies that had rejected the implants in horrific ways. Aspirants whose bones had grown inward, crushing their organs. Whose muscles had torn themselves apart. Whose brains had been destroyed by incompatible psychoconditioning. This is what happens when the process goes wrong. And it goes wrong constantly. The gene seed is degrading, has been degrading for millennia, and we can't stop it. We just keep throwing aspirants at the problem, hoping enough survive to maintain chapter strength. More files. Statistics on mental deterioration. Battle brothers who'd broken during combat and had to be executed by their own sergeants. Veterans who'd developed phobias or personality fractures that made them unstable. The careful manipulation of memory and conditioning required to keep warriors functional despite the horrors they experienced. The hypno-conditioning we use is crude, Hadrian continued. We suppress natural responses, redirect trauma into aggression, chemically alter your brain to remove anything that might interfere with combat effectiveness. But human psychology isn't meant to be rewired like that. The conditioning always breaks eventually. We just hope it breaks after you're already dead. Cale absorbed it all. The mathematics of misery. The calculated cruelty of a system that ground up children and spat out weapons. The cold truth that every space marine was a tragedy wearing power armor. And the worst part? Hadrian pulled up one final file. Most of the wars we fight don't matter. Not in the grand scheme. We deploy to thousands of battlefields across the galaxy, we die in droves, and the strategic impact is negligible. The Imperium is so vast, so decayed, so fundamentally broken that our sacrifices are statistical noise in a war that cannot be won. Then why do we keep fighting? Because it's all we can do. Because if we stopped, if every Space Marine chapter simultaneously refused to deploy, the Imperium would collapse within a decade. We're not fighting to win. We're fighting to delay the inevitable. And we use warriors like you as ammunition in that delaying action. Cale stood in the archive, surrounded by the truth of his existence, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years. Actual, genuine emotion. Rage at the system that had taken him. Grief for all the aspirants who died becoming weapons. Horror at the scope of the lie he'd been living. And underneath it all, a strange kind of relief. Because at least now he knew. At least now he could see the chains that bound him. I need to show you one more thing, Hadrian said. He led Cale to a sealed chamber deep in the battle barge's bowels. Inside, suspended in stasis fields, were hundreds of aspirants in various stages of transformation. Some were barely modified. Some were so altered they looked like human-shaped. Tumors. All of them were alive, technically. All of them were suffering. Failed transformations that we couldn't simply terminate, Hadrian explained. Their gene seed is still viable, so we keep them alive for future harvesting. Some have been in stasis for decades. Conscious, aware, unable to die. This is where you would have ended up if your transformation had gone slightly differently. Cale looked at the twisted bodies in their stasis tubes and finally understood the full scope of what the Imperium did to create its angels of death. They weren't angels. They were victims. Children brutalized and mutilated and psychologically destroyed in the name of a cause that ground through warriors like a manufacturer processed raw materials. So what do you choose? Hadrian asked. Reconditioning and comfortable ignorance? Or awareness and the weight that comes with it? Cale turned away from the stasis tubes, made his decision. I choose awareness. I choose to remember. Even if it destroys me, I choose to understand what I am. Hadrian nodded slowly. Then you join a very small group. Battle brothers who know the truth and carry it anyway. It won't be easier. It'll actually be much harder. Every deployment, every casualty, every order you follow, you'll understand exactly what it costs. And you'll have to do it anyway because what's the alternative? Desert and become a traitor? Refuse orders and get executed? Kill yourself and waste everything you've endured? There must be something else. Some way to serve without perpetuating this horror. If you find it, tell me. I've been looking for 51 years. They stood in silence. Two space marines who'd seen behind the curtain and couldn't unsee it. Around them, the battle barge hummed with activity. Thousands of brothers going about their duties. Training, praying, preparing for the next deployment. All of them conditioned. All of them believing the lies that made service possible. Does it ever get easier? Cale asked. No, Hadrian said. It just becomes familiar. Cale returned to his squad the next day. Deployed to another war zone. Killed another batch of enemies whose deaths ultimately meant nothing in the Imperium's slow collapse. watched another brother die, this one named Castor, took a tyrannid toxin through the neck, bled out in 16 seconds, and felt the grief the conditioning was no longer suppressing. He functioned. He fought. He survived. But now he did it with full awareness of what he'd become. A broken weapon in a broken system, deployed by a broken Imperium to fight wars that couldn't be won. The Emperor protects, they said. But Kale knew the truth now. The Emperor was 10,000 years dead, rotting on a golden throne while his empire consumed its children to fuel its own prolonged dying. And space marines like him were just one more piece of fuel for the fire. He'd chosen awareness, chosen truth, chosen to carry the weight of understanding what he was. And every day since, he wondered if Sergeant Dravos had made the wiser choice. Being a space marine isn't an honor. It's a death sentence written in gene seed and hypno-conditioning, executed over years of brutality that strips away everything human until only the weapon remains. They tell children it's glorious. They tell aspirants it's the highest calling. They tell the Imperium that space marines are the Emperor's finest warriors. They don't tell you about the 68% who die screaming on surgical slabs. About the veterans who eat their bolt pistols because awareness becomes unbearable. About the mathematical certainty that your name will end up on a plaque in a reclusium, marking a life spent as ammunition in a war that cannot be won. Death is clean. Death is final. Death is mercy. Being a space marine is so much worse than death. It's living death, stretched across decades of combat. Watching brothers fall while you march forward because the conditioning won't let you stop. It's awareness slowly returning as the hypno-conditioning cracks, until you finally understand what was done to you and can't undo it. It's serving an Imperium that sees you as a resource to be expended, not a person to be valued. They break you during transformation. They rebuild you during training. They deploy you until you break again, permanently this time. And the galaxy doesn't even notice when you're gone. That's the truth they don't put in the propaganda. That's the reality every space marine lives until they finally die. They aren't heroes. They're victims who've been weaponized. And they'll keep being created, 10,000 children fed into the machine every year, because the Imperium has no other choice. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And war needs ammunition.